Right, give everyone welcome. Give everyone just a minute to get settled. We skipped the last break, but we'll get started very soon. Maybe just one more minute, and then we'll throw it over to you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging with us throughout this jam-packed day. And for joining us for the concluding keynote address for this year's City Tech Science Fiction Symposium on Science Fiction, Gender, and Sexuality. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, critically acclaimed author, filmmaker, dancer, and independent scholar, Ytasha Womack. Womack tours the world championing Afrofuturism and the role of the imagination. Her works in Afrofuturism have been translated into Portuguese and Spanish for markets in Brazil and Latin America, and Afrofuturism is taught in high schools and universities across the world. Today, she will be delivering a keynote address titled Afrofuturism, Time, Space Relations, and Valuing Humanity. Please extend a warm virtual welcome to our keynote speaker.
Hello, everyone. This is such a pleasure to be sharing with you today. I am delighted and full of joy and full of glee, and also acknowledging that this is a time when we are deeply reflecting on humanity and what it means to extend humanity, to connect deeper with ourselves, to be deeper in community, and to recognize that we're in a global community and what valuing our contributions to this earth plane means. So I do want to acknowledge that space. And in sharing with you, I am excited, of course, to talk about one of my favorite subject matters, Afrofuturism. And just to brief you a bit, Afrofuturism is having quite the moment. We have an Afrofuturism exhibit currently at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. That exhibit began in February of this year and has been extended into August of next year. It was supposed to wrap in February of 2024. This year, the Metropolitan Opera House, rather, has a play celebrating the life of Malcolm X, which has Afrofuturist themes. And we are in a period where Afrofuturism is recognized as a leading creative method, practice, aesthetic, one that is being utilized as people are crafting futures and looking to the African diaspora and the African continent and the lived experiences and the wisdom in those spaces to help shape the next. And we're in a space when we're looking at Afrofuturism as a way of not just creating new works today, but in helping to categorize or usher in works from the past to sort of add a new context to how we can look at the literature of the past. So today we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois's short story, The Comet, And we can acknowledge that that is, in fact, a sci-fi story. It is an Afrofuturist story that was at one point in a book that comprised other essays. And in the midst of those essays was a speculative fiction story, an Afrofuturist story that wasn't quite viewed in that way until it was put in an Afrofuturist context in an anthology by Cherie Renee Thomas called Dark Matter that came out, I want to say in year 2000. And we are able to recognize other works. We're thinking about the novel of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins. And this is a novel that began actually as a series that she wrote in 1902, 1903, that was published in African American newspapers on a consistent basis, and then later put into a book. But it told the story of a man who was passing, Black man who was passing for white, and then went off to a world very much like Wakanda. But it was a world he stumbled upon in Ethiopia that was a technologically advanced, futuristic society that was hidden, and also doubles back into some family history as well. So in the fiction arena, we're realizing that, wow, there are a lot of lenses for uncovering and looking at works that were in fact Afrofuturist or um, fall in the science fiction category. But we also acknowledge that just the idea of thinking about a future is not new under the sun for people, Black people, people of the African diaspora or of the continent. And I have to say that while I'm excited about Afrofuturism, I'm also excited how the conversation about Afrofuturism has helped people to recognize the contributions from the culture to ways of thinking about the future, but also has really helped to give rise for communities around the world thinking about how their communities and ethnic groups have also had a wealth of stories and beliefs and philosophies that engaged futures. Among those are indigenous futurism. And it's a delight to see both indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism discussed in similar contexts as we look to craft futures that value humanity. So I'm going to see here if I could share my screen. Of course I can. And there you go. And I'm showing you, I'm just going to show you a few images here. This, of course, is the book Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, which actually came out at the end of 2013. And when I was writing this book, I was in a space where I realized that I was an Afrofuturist, didn't know I was an Afrofuturist. And I wrote the book largely because I was in conversation with people who brought up the term. And I said, well, where did this term come from? You know, I was a person who was a journalist and had written a great deal about the culture. I knew a lot of people who were into science fiction or were looking at how to bridge futures and histories and talking about ancient technologies and futuristic technologies that could be created and how to foster liberation. And they're doing this referencing Black culture, but they weren't using the term Afrofuturism. And many of them felt marginalized in thinking about these ideas, as if to think about them it didn't quite fit in how people talked about futures. Didn't quite fit in how they spoke about the culture. And yet, it was a pervasive conversation, certainly one that defined my college years at Clark Atlanta University. So when I was speaking to someone who told me that they were teaching Afrofuturism, I said, well, what is that? You know, immediately it took me back to all these familiar experiences my own relationship to time and space, my relationship to aspirations and dreams and imagining. So to be able to write the book was quite a joy. And doing so took place at a time when there were an array of changes sort of happening in society. Social media was stepping into another level. And people were able to find one another online in ways that they weren't previously. So between this book, Afrofuturism, coming out, The Shadow Took Shape, which was a Afrofuturist retrospective at the Studio Museum of Harlem, along with another anthology called the Mother Box Connection that came out, there was just a growing celebration and recognition of the wisdom and insights and imaginatory tools that came from thinking about futures from the African diaspora and the continent. I like to remind people that all cultures have a relationship to space and time. African diasporic cultures in that sense being no different. And but these relationships to space and time, as they are evident in African diasporic cultures, you can see it in art or literature, language, dance, architecture, communing, ways of being, organizing, mythology, envisioning. And when I define Afrofuturism, I say that it's a way of looking at futures or alternate realities through African diasporic cultural lenses, through Black cultural lenses. Those are terms that overlap. And if you think about Black culture as being at the center, and there really being this intersection of imagination, technology, mysticism, liberation, any work, any approach that engages those ideas could be defined as Afrofuturist. The Afrofuturist relationship to space and time is actually informed by philosophy, spiritual practices, cosmology, geography, and space and time. So literally, it's defined in part by when you were born and where you were born. And I like to emphasize this because, and let me just emphasize, I'm not talking about Einstein space-time definitions, right? We're talking about cultural relationships to space and time, how one experiences space and time, and what values around space and time are evident in the works and the lived experiences and the cosmologies that people shape. And much of that is shaped by, in part, where you were born and then when you were born. And when I talk about Afrofuturism, I talk about this relationship between mysticism and technology. Sometimes they're flip sides of the same coin. Other times they inform one another. And it's this valuing of intuition, and in the same ways that we value the systems, the imaginative systems that we create, the communal systems that we create, that helps to really forge new directions for us. And there's also this idea of identity. Our identity is in part shaped by our relationship to space and time. And here I say, I'm looking at, in the time that we're in now, one's identity could easily be attached to the data that we generate, where we're both consumer and sometimes product and sometimes data. And one of our questions as we think about technology and the role that technology plays in our life is we want to think about, does our technology or do these algorithms in the tech we use override our intuition? Are our observations about the environment somehow, are we not paying attention to our observations about the environment? Is our sense of discovery in some ways undermined by how we use technology? And I bring this up because there's this relationship between our identity, between our relationship to space and time, between how we approach technologies, are all ideas that Afrofuturism wrestles with. Within the Afrofuturist context, they recognize that systems of organizing are also technologies. Race is a technology in that it is this sort of created way of both framing people. One, of course, that was in some respects, as it comes to Black and white, was in part shaped through law and violence. And while we're chipping away at those things, we have to recognize that many of the categories that we place ourselves in are also imaginative constructions that now have a real impact on our lives. It's after the end of the world, don't you know that yet? This is one of Sun Ra's favorite quotes. Sun Ra, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the celebrated jazz musician. Some say he was from Birmingham. He says he was originally from Saturn, and had an epiphany, likely in his years when he was doing research and playing in Chicago, had this realization that he was not just a person on Earth, but was a person whose sense of feeling restricted was a reflection of the fact that he was from somewhere else. And he was so informed by this idea that he reached out to both the mysticism of ancient Egypt and used a lot of that to create these futuristic visions of how to think about a reality that in fact valued humanity. So the inhumane treatment that he sometimes experienced, he rationalized by saying that he was in fact an alien, but one who was brought here to Earth to heal the world with music. And there's something about his capacity for transformation that I think has inspired people in recent years. This capacity for transformation and this ability to take that level of transformation and then be so committed to creating art that could elevate and help others. But his most iconic work was one called Space is the Place. And Space is the Place, it talks about the altered destiny, trying to get to this altered destiny. And I had the privilege of being able to write the liner notes for the reissue of that album that came out this year. And it was interesting because I saw the film before. If you have not seen the Space is the Place film, I suggest that you do. But I saw the film, but I hadn't quite listened to the album from beginning to end. And I was listening to it. You know, Sun Ra really created this sonic journey, which in some ways is an evolution of humanity with respect to how humanity sees goals and barriers. And when you're thinking, when he's talking about going to the altered destiny, you know, and you're just listening to the album, you're assuming, okay, he's talking about this imaginative, distant world, right? Then you're going with it, and you're saying, okay, we're going to the altered destiny, this protopian space where humanity is valued. And as you start listening, you're thinking, okay, it's a physical destination. And then at some point, you're thinking, okay, is it a future world? And then there's moments where it starts to feel as if he's talking about present day Earth. This is more of a metaphor. You're not really going to a future world. It's a metaphor for creating a state of consciousness in the present. And then there's narratives where you say, oh, okay, he's talking about the altered destiny as this space in the past. And then, you know, you keep listening and he says things like how he's, you know, the brother to the wind. And you're thinking, wait a minute, this is an element, like an alchemic transformation. And as and then as you get towards the end of the album, he says, in so many words that you're not quite ready yet. And that while you're getting yourself together or trying to be transformed, they will go and build a place, which then sort of establishes it as the yet to be. And I like talking about this because I think it is a paradigm for thinking about our relationships, to our dreams, to our aspirations, to our futures. But it also shows just how transient or ephemeral spaces can be, how we occupy both imagined spaces and physical spaces. We have the dream spaces, our imagined spaces. We have the memories, which are in other spaces. And as individuals, we're constantly sort of navigating all these spaces. And so when we think about a relationship to space and time, it's not just the one that we are physically in, it's also these spaces that we are in our mind, or in some cases, our virtual spaces. When we are gathering, as we are now in this virtual space, where are we? Yes, physically, I'm sitting here, but also I am, or we are in this sort of shared altered space, where we are in fact together. And to that extent, hypothetically, we're occupying sort of two spaces at the same time, or we're hopping between these two spaces at the same time. And as we continue to move into virtual spaces, I think they will become symbols of how we are always navigating through different spaces, both physical and non-physical spaces, and our relationships and our experiences to those spaces, whether they're actual memories or aspirational future spaces, inform where we are today. I like to remind people that when I talk about Afrofuturism, I center Sankofa. And Sankofa is the Akan symbol that is part of a pantheon of Adinkra symbols. And the Akan are an ethnic group out of Ghana. And the Sankofa symbol is among their most popular. If you look at the symbol on the chest of our character here, if you look at the symbol that's on the shield, that is the Sankofa symbol. And it is probably among the more popular African symbols in the African diaspora, particularly in America. Whether you see the symbol physically or you see another version that looks like a bird, that looks back at an egg on its tail, or whether you just see the word itself. And this word Sankofa, in simple terms, means to retrieve. It can mean you can always go back. And in the Afrofuturist sense, I like to think about it as bringing the best of the past into the future. In order to move forward, you in some ways have to bring those things that are the best of the past into our future as building blocks. And that becomes a method and a practice. One that in musical ways you see with the idea of sampling, one that you see with a lot of the collage work that's so popular as an aesthetic in America and African American local art scenes. But also, just this term Sankofa is one that is a reminder that your future and your past and your present are constantly informing one another. And so when we become very conscious of that, how does that transform our relationship to space and time? This is just a really cool image that John Jennings did. Actually, most of these images John Jennings put together, and some of them are, like this one, are part of Black Kirby, which is a duo with John Jennings and Stacey Robinson. they are inverting or they are building on the work of Jack Kirby, but imagining the kinds of covers he would have created or the imagery he would have created if he was Black. So, in thinking of our relationships to space and time, and thinking about these spaces that we occupy mentally, physically, and otherwise, um, it's always just important to think about what are our emotions in these spaces? What are we thinking in these spaces? And how is it changing us as we move forward? And I think about, again, our technologies, and I think it's a worthwhile exercise when we do either take breaks from them or when we do engage with them to really think about how our technologies or are our technologies um, reinforcing this connection or are they enhancing connection? Um, and how are you feeling as you're engaging in these spaces? Rayla 2212 is the first novel that I wrote, inspired by my work when I was writing the book Afrofuturism. And one of the quotes from the book um, comes from a character named Milan Shakur. And she says, humankind has always been obsessed with the great beyond, but what's out there is really in here, she said, clutching her hand to her breast. Our outer space is inner space. And in the storytelling world, when we're crafting stories for plays or for film or in short stories and narrative, you're creating your characters, and your characters usually want something. And these characters are seeking to achieve this goal. And sometimes there's some antagonists, right? That's one of the basic sort of formats for a storyline. But this character is in a world. And in building this world, there's an intricate relationship between the character and the world that they're in. And I like to remind you that you too are in a world. We are in a world. And there is a symbiotic relationship between us and the worlds that we're in. We are constantly co creating with the spaces around us. Our visions, our dreams, our actions are shaping futures that we move into. And we are as informed by the past that we're aware of. We are as informed by the past that we aren't aware of, the geopolitical dynamics, which lent itself to our birth or where we were born. Um, but we're also informed by our dreams and our aspirations. We make decisions based on what we think is possible. And to the extent that we don't, there are other people who are dreaming worlds for us to step into. So I encourage you, as you think about Afrofuturism, as you engage in science fiction, as you face, as you're in moments that can feel challenging, that you remember the level of resilience that has come through holding dear to a future and the actions that we take when we believe in a future that values humanity and then do the work to bring it about. So with that, I would like to see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop share here. See. Okay.
Thank you so much for that. Let's see. We did have another thing pop up from Vivian's class. Can you recommend a book or books for someone just getting into the genre of Afrofuturism?
Yes, I can. Actually, I have a couple over here that I can recommend for you. Of course, I like my book, Afrofuturism. But there's another book in Afrofuturism, which I contributed to, called Afrofuturism, A History of Black Futures, which is a companion book that goes with the exhibit that is at the Smithsonian. So that's a great book that you can purchase at your favorite bookstore or you can get online. If you're a Black Panther fan, I also have this book, Black Panther, A Cultural Exploration. And it talks about the history of the comic book. So many of us have seen the film. We have diehard fans of the comic. But if you haven't read the comic and you want to do a deep dive, or you're trying to figure out where to start, this book can give you some insights into some things that have happened in the past, some storylines, the symbolism, the cultural references, how Wakanda informed, or rather, how the culture informed the Black Panther mythos, and how the Black Panther mythos has in turn shaped us. So I would suggest that book. It also came out last month, so I'm really excited about it. And another fun one, I know I'm giving you some nonfiction here, but if you're into music, I like this book, Assembling a Black Counterculture. And it's really about the history of techno music in Detroit, and really places it, there's some people who think of techno, they sometimes placed it as maybe outside of the bounds of how Black music evolved in America. But the reality is, as DeForest Brown emphasizes, is that it's very much a reflection of both the Great Migration, but also this relationship that Black cultures have had to technology, whether people were viewed as technologies, in the sense of them being like these robot workers enslaved and on plantations, or whether you're literally thinking about people working in factories, the culture of Detroit sort of shifting, like many spaces, from this sort of factory culture to evolving into a newer space, and the role that utilizing technology played in shaping music that reflected probable futures. A lot of techno music was looking to create a new world. And I'll stop there.
We have a great question from Professor Dion Bennett in the comments. Can you elaborate on the role of gender in the spatial politics of Afrofuturism?
Sure. Well, when it comes to gender, I would say Afrofuturism is very feminist. Afrofuturist is very queer. Afrofuturist is a space that values humanity, and is, even in stories like, I think about Wakanda in some ways, and how just Wakanda has expanded in these issues, where in the comic book, where the question becomes, what does a protopia look like, right? When Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing the comic, he's questioning, does the ultimate Black society have democracy? Would you have a monarch? And then, the next iteration of that, you had different writers saying, well, the ultimate Black society has to value queer relationships. The ultimate Black society has to value trans relationships. So I've always, noted, in books, whether we're looking at, the works of Samuel Delany, who is as known for his books on queer culture, queer expression, as he is for his writings of science fiction, giving way to Afrofuturism. I think about Octavia Butler's work, and how various characters are always sort of pushing norms. And I think about how the beauty of Afrofuturist spaces is that everyone can show up in a way through which they see themselves. There is no one aesthetic. There is no one look. There is no one way of being, other than valuing humanity and valuing the contributions of the African continent and diaspora. So when I think about, this, I just see it as a pretty open space. I mean, a lot of the creators and innovators of Afrofuturism have been women. we talk about Mark Derry coining the term, but the term was very much popularized by Alondra Nelson and her listserv. When she, a lot of the conferences, those early conferences that were put together using the term Afrofuturism, were in part, started by Alondra Nelson and many women who were putting together conferences, exploring technology. I would even say today, a lot of the organizing, a great deal of the organizing around Afrofuturist events sometimes is put together by a lot of women as well. So, from Octavia Butler to even some of our African futurists like Nadia Korafor and others, I think that women are well represented, and queerness is very much centered as well.
Thank you so much. I think that maybe covers one additional question we have here. What commonalities are there between Afrofuturism and ideas surrounding gender and space relations? That was such a full answer. But do you have anything additional you want to add about this specific question?
Gender and space relations? No, I don't think so.
Okay. So we also have another question about books. This one is from Jacob Adler, who's a fellow librarian, who is wondering if there are any recent teen or YA Afrofuturist novels out that he could recommend to a teen librarian, and that he remembers reading The Ear, the Eye, and the Arm as a child and quite enjoying it. That, I think between us, Jacob, we probably could figure that out. But do you have specific recommendations that gear, lean younger?
I do. There's a book called Maddie's Rocket that's put together by Tim Fielder, and it follows a young girl who grew up in the segregated South, but she grows up to fly spaceships. And so it's sort of an alternate telling of, pre-40s America, but it's through the eyes of a young girl who grows up. So that's a graphic novel that I think is really cool. And there's another book that is top of mind. Let me try to look it up here and try to have it for you by the end of the questioning section. People always ask me about children's books, and I'm so into like the theory and the hard hitting. I'm like, oh yeah, the kid books. So give me 1 second. I'll have another one for you.
Sure. I mean, but I guess that begs a good question. Are we limiting younger readers by looking for things specifically for them? I guess in light of banned books and everything. And because Afrofuturism is so expansive as regards to sex and gender and who is in power and how power is yielded, would it not be better, to have teens and young adults read wider of that, regardless of the intended audience?
Well, I would say absolutely. And the reason I say that is because I, as a young reader, I mean, the joy of going to the adult section of the library is, one that's indescribable. But I think I was going to the adult section of the library, maybe it's 7th grade.
Me too.
I was going there at 7th grade. I was going through my parents' books in the attic. I'm reading Chariots of the Gods. I'm reading Thursday's Child by Eartha Kitt, her biography. I read Song of Solomon. I read, by Toni Morrison. I read The Bluest Eye, when I was in the 7th grade. I read Black Boy when I was an 8th grader. And these weren't required reading. This was just me looking for, stories with Black characters and finding them to be really interesting. And I started reading nonfiction the library I went to as a kid, and thank you for asking this question because I love libraries. But the library I went to as a kid, the children's section didn't have as much fiction with Black characters. They had a few, but not as many as we have now. And so I found myself gravitating towards the nonfiction section of the children's library because, at least there, I could find, they had a whole section on African American biographies. And so I started reading nonfiction really early, and started reading about science really early. And those science books, they get pretty heady pretty soon. So, yeah, I don't know what to, the banned book conversation. Clearly, I'm not for banning books. I think that you want to be aware of what someone's kind of reading up until third, fourth grade. You don't, but beyond that, when it comes to reading about our culture, the wealth of stories out there are not going to fit neatly in anyone's box. If you're reading some of the classics, I think, as soon as someone's able to actually read them, it's okay. And if it's talking about things that they don't quite understand, it'll go over their head, or, as a parent, you can take a look and sort of discuss it. A lot of our science fiction, even the books that are, I would say, more young adult friendly, but I get the impression you're asking about kids. But I mean, as you start moving into young adult and you're talking about science fiction, it's always going to push the envelope. But I think the thing to recognize is our kids are living in worlds where they're engaging with a lot of information. And, you want them to have some sort of working understanding around what they're bumping into because they're bumping into it anyway.
We have a question from Lee. Well, two interesting questions. One, thinking about Sun Ra as musician, music, and time, space, can you talk a little bit about how dance can fit in? Specifically, can dance, even as a metaphor, help us return more to the inner space?
Absolutely. And usually I always talk about dance in my talks. And so I'm glad you asked this question because I grew up as a dancer. I am a dancer. And a lot of my relationship to understanding Afrofuturism came because I grew up in metaphysics, a philosophy that centered metaphysics, but also because I grew up dancing. And, when you take tap from the age of, say, 6 to 17, or you're taking ballet and all these African classes, modern classes, pom-pom, rhythm, it's just encoded in you. You can hear, beats and patterns in the wind. So dance is probably the ultimate, well, I'm a little biased here, but I would say it's the ultimate relationship to space and time because you're literally moving in a space to these measured times and beats. You're finding a way to flow either over a rhythm or between beats and rhythms, hitting things on beats and rhythms. And you might say, well, what difference does any of that make? Well, when you learn dances from different cultural vantage points, there's different rhythms and tempos, and those different rhythms and tempos have a meaning. So we can find ourselves, dancing to, say, one set of music, and that's what we do. We move to one set of music. Then you hear another set of music, and you're like, "Oh my goodness, I don't know how to move to this," or how do I approach this? And to me, being able to shift from one to the other or to become comfortable moving to one set of rhythms as you move, as you're sort of shifting, it allows you to break past barriers that you have that you didn't even know you had around not just how you can move, or how you relate in a space, but you're sort of physically pushing past barriers that become symbols for other barriers you might have, because many of the approaches people have to life are embraced, are reflected in the rhythms and the movements and the kinds of dances that come out of these cultures, ancient and contemporary. A lot of African American dances are variations of ancient dances, just sort of mishmashed together. And as you learn various cultures and some of the traditional dances, or even looking at the contemporary dances, you can see where things come from. You could see those different trains and of those spaces of influence that came across the water through the transatlantic slave trade, but also as we inform one another, in our newfound freedoms in the past several decades, right? So I think of dance as something that could be both a personal practice and a communal way of recognizing that we are shared human beings in a universe. And our relationship to space and time, our shared relationship to space and time, is that we're literally on this earth, in this space, at this time, in this universe, at this time. We're communing with those who've done these kinds of movements before. We're giving an homage and some respect to ancestors. We are connected to people who will do these movements in the future. And whether we're conscious of that or not, the joy and the sense of celebration that we have is an outgrowth of those motions.
Thank you. So we have another question in the Q&A from Professor Lavelle Porter. You mentioned that Afrofuturism is having a moment. Since you have been following and writing about Afrofuturism for a long time, do you ever feel any reservations or skepticism about its new popularity? And then a parenthetical that says, I guess that's a tired question about going mainstream, but would still like to know what you think about it.
Well, I think it's great because it opens the doors of opportunity for people to create stories and to get them out to the public. So the popularity of it just enables people to create works and have an audience. There was a science fiction conference, and I think it was called a Black Science Fiction Conference. It was at Clark Atlanta University, I believe in 1997, 98. And there were just a handful of Black science fiction writers there. They weren't even using the term Afrofuturism necessarily. And, among them are Tananarive Due and Octavia Butler. And, literally, you're just dealing with a handful of people. Now, if you had a room of people who call themselves Afrofuturists, who are writers and creators and musicians, it would be a pretty big room. They might not even be able to fit in the same room. You might not even be able to get everybody there at the same time. So I don't think we understand how difficult it was, even before the film Black Panther, which was the first film just came out several years ago, how difficult it was to have a Black science fiction story and pitch it to a publisher. I mean, it sounds wild, but it's, to pitch a story to a publisher in a futuristic world with Black characters, to draw pictures. I mean, one of the reasons that the independent comic book scene for Black creators became so big, once social media and the internet became more of a thing, in the 2010-ish, 11, 12, etc. One of the reasons it became so popular was because people wanted to create these works and they couldn't get them out. And now they're in a time where it's easier to publish on demand and to print your work digitally. And as soon as people were able to do that, they created these comic book conventions, and then we're in some of the major comic book conventions, and we're able to connect. So, this is no small thing. In very real time, in very real time, I saw people's careers elevate, people get new audiences, and people who were excited about these ideas realize, oh, wait, there's a term called Afrofuturism. And if I find things associated with that term, I'll be able to find more works that I like, whether it's in Botswana or it's in Chicago. So the ability to have audiences who are excited about these works, that is a newer phenomenon, and you know, not something to take for granted.
Thank you. We do have one last question here that came up in the chat that I think in a way is connected to what you're saying, even though I'm not sure that I agree that this film, it says, or that I'm aware of this film. Can we say that the movie Hidden Spaces falls into this genre? This is from Elizabeth Cruz, that they really liked the movie and thought it sent a great message. I am not familiar with this film.
Haven't seen it yet either. I haven't seen it yet. Forgive me. But one way to see if it is to think about, does it integrate imagination, technology, liberation, and mysticism, and center Black cultures, African diasporic cultures? That would be the big question. If it does, then you could say it's Afrofuturist. And sometimes, too, something doesn't have to be Afrofuturist, but it can reference Afrofuturism, or it can be aligned with Afrofuturism. There are a lot of music artists, I might not describe them as Afrofuturist, but they might have said things or performed the song that you could say, oh, all right, that falls within how one would talk about Afrofuturism. Because Afrofuturism, I talk about it as a relationship to space and time, but it's an aesthetic, but it's also a way of perceiving life. And so to that extent, it's not like just a genre, right? And that's something to sort of keep in mind. There are people who, their way of approaching things can be very much Afrofuturist. It could be an aesthetic. You see it like with Parliament Funkadelic or Janelle Monáe, or it really pops out when you're reading certain books like the Black Panther comic book, right? Or Tim Felder's Infinitum, right? You're like, oh, wow, okay, this is Afrofuturism. But it's not just a genre and it's aesthetic. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, maybe that's a good note to end on. There was a miscommunication with the title of the film, but I think that your answer helps me to put it in context. I mean, I guess the only thing that can be a little bit difficult for me when thinking about Afrofuturism is that I can equate it more to the steampunk genre, right? Like steampunk books are not always set in the future. And so I understand that kind of instinctively, but with Afrofuturism, I have a tendency to want to push it. It's not a looking back and reimagining the past, but it is. It can be.
Right. And, one of the things that makes Afrofuturism different from, other takes on sci-fi is that it recognizes that the future, the past, and present can happen simultaneously. That these times are all related, right? And you see that in a lot of the storytelling. You see that in a lot of the imagery, where you're looking at, say, a futuristic image, or even if you're looking at Sun Ra, right? I mean, he's the quintessential person to reference, because just symbolically, he looks like he is from future space. He's literally saying he's from the altered destiny, and simultaneously, he's naming himself after an ancient Egyptian deity. So he's pulling from two different aesthetics at the same time. And we see that if you're looking at the costuming in the film Black Panther, you see that, I would say with most Afrofuturist images, you see this sort of conscious mixing of things that we think of as ancient, future, and present. And depending on the world that they're creating, it's an altered reality, but not always a future space.
Right.
So I think as long as we think it could be a future or an alternate reality, right? And when we think of it in that way, I think it's, you say, oh, okay, that's what Afrofuturism is. Now, that said, you can have something that's Black speculative fiction that might not squarely be Afrofuturist from an aesthetic standpoint. So if something's very Afro-surrealist, for example, where it's not technology and it seems very present, that sort of work, sort of an Afro-surrealist work. I mean, I think of Boots Riley, and some of the work that he does is sort of falling in that category.
Thank you so much for closing out a very packed day of learning and sharing. Thank you, one final time to our keynote speaker. Thank you to my co-organizers, Lee and Lucas, Kel, Jill, Sean, and Vivian. Thank you to the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Justin Vasquez-Ports, for his continuing support. Thank you to our new sponsor who provided funding to hold this event this year, from the LGBTQIA+ working group that we have here on our campus. And thank you to everyone who participated today and who joined us and who stuck it out for the whole day with us. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.